The Rougarou meets the Boogity Man, a Louisiana cryptids story collection. Dear Scary Stories NYC, because of the passing of a beloved relative, my family and I have begun to take it upon ourselves to compile our family legends. I wonder if you might be interested in some of them for your show, because my family lived for generations in an area of constant turf battle between the Dogman, which my ancestors called the Rougarou, and the Bigfoot or Sasquatch, which they colorfully referred to as the Boogity Man. I'm going to tell you about the big, scary, hairy man of the shadows that you would call a squatch, and I'm going to tell you stories of the legendary upright walking wolf. But I'm going to start off with the only story that anyone in my family has ever heard told around here that claims a meeting between the Dogman and the Boogity Man. This sort of destroy all monsters narrative that my mother used to tell me when I was a kid was called either Missy and the Monster Battle or Rougarou versus the Boogity Man. This was my favorite one when I was a kid, so I probably heard it the most often out of all of them. Each time it was told to me was slightly different, but I'll try to do a representative version here. Only one of Grandma Lou's 3 sisters married and had children. Her name was Missy, or that was her nickname in the family. Missy ended up moving out west where she met her eventual husband, but when she was a teenager, she dated some of the boys from the area. One night, she and her latest beau went driving and found a secluded place under a tree to park their car in the darkness and do what teenagers do. No sooner had they parked, though, when there was a loud crash on their car roof, which actually dented in on them. They thought the tree had fallen on them and were both screaming, unsure if they were about to be crushed to death. Everything settled down, and they could see the tree still standing next to them. They couldn't understand what had just happened, and they were too scared to move or speak. And then they saw the heel of the largest foot they had ever seen come down hard on their car's hood. The foot led up to a very hairy leg, and before they could comprehend all that, the other foot came crashing down too. It was the Boogity Man. It was a Sasquatch. It must have been up in the tree when they drove up there. Disturbed, it leaped down on the top of their car, then walked onto their hood, and with only one more step, he was off the front hood of the car, walking away, carrying something in his arms. They could only see the creature from the rear, so they didn't have an angle to see what was in the monster's arms, but he used both of them to carry it, whatever it was, so it must have been bigger than a bread box. Missy and her boyfriend sat there not wanting to move until the creature was out of sight. They felt they must have offended it, and quite frankly, they were terrified at that moment. But before the Boogity Man could walk away from them, the most incredible thing in all of my Grandma Lou's stories happened. The Rougarou flew out of the underbrush and tackled the Boogity Man. Finally, the 2 main archetypal monsters from my childhood would meet. It was sort of our family's version of Hulk versus Thor, but we were taught this was all very, very real. I'm not saying we all necessarily believed it was real, but Grandma Lou certainly repeated the story often enough that we believed that she believed it was. So there they were, the Dogman Rougarou versus the Boogity Bigfoot. Both of them tumbled onto the ground, Dogman on top, each viciously attacking the other, but with a distinct temporary advantage for the dog-headed man. Whatever the Sasquatch had been carrying went flying out of view to their left. Missy suggested strongly to their beau that they get the Model A out of there. Now, starting a Model A Ford isn't as easy as starting a modern car. First, you have to push one lever all the way up. Then you push another lever half the way down. After that, you turn the gas valve on. Then, turn the choke 3/4 clockwise. Unless it's cold, then you turn it 1 full turn clockwise. Got that? Okay, we're just getting started here. At any rate, eventually that car was started, and then the couple discovered that when the huge ape man had leaped down on them, he had sunk their tires deep in the mud. They were stuck, and they had little choice but to sit there watching the huge dog-headed man battle the terrifying man-beast who had just walked all over them in a quite literal sense. It must have been a very helpless feeling to be stuck there like that. In this story, the Rougarou or Dogman is not in any way intelligent. He behaves as a savage jungle beast. The Boogity Man or Sasquatch, however, was referred to as forest royalty and the spirit of the woods when my mother used to tell the story to me when I was young. Both of them seem equally horrifying to me, though. Either of them can take you out anytime they want. They go around in the dark. They just show up without announcing themselves. Even though they're nocturnal, they might jump you during the day. They like to mess with people for no good reason. I still feel a bit of PTSD just from the one time I saw one of them that I'll tell you about later in the show. I can't imagine the bravery of Grandma Lou and her family if even half or a third of these stories are true. It sounds like she grew up seeing her own species, the human species, as down about number 3 on the food chain. And so her sister Missy, stuck in the Model A Ford, began to wonder what would happen when the fight they were witnessing was over. Would it be better for them if one of the creatures won or the other? Even if the monsters both left them alone, how would they get out of this place that was too muddy to drive or possibly to walk in? I would imagine her mind was racing, as she was known as a very resourceful person. According to the story, the enraged Sasquatch tore an entire tree up out of the ground and swung it around, slamming the Rougarou into another tree and causing the dog-headed creature to emit the most awful howling and yapping. Supposedly, the Bigfoot rammed the roots of that tree right down that dogman's throat. I didn't believe that was possible until I saw the original King Kong vs. Godzilla, and Kong does that exact thing to Godzilla. At any rate, someone throwing a tree into my mouth would be about all I could take, and I would be down for the count. But the Rougarou, the Dogman? Well, that only made the Dogman mad. The growling canine man simply ran down the length of the tree, leaping headfirst into the face of the Sasquatch, and once again, the two massive beasts rolled around through the weeds, snapping at each other's throats. It would seem for a moment as though the Rougarou had the advantage, and then the Boogity Man would pull a surprise maneuver and regain the momentum. Whatever they were fighting over, I hope it was worth it. Missy's beau began to panic and said they should run for it. Missy pointed out that they'd probably get stuck in the mud same as the car had. The young man was foolish, however, so in his panic, he jumped out of the car and, well, that's about it. He jumped out, got stuck, and would only have been able to move if he took his feet out of his boots, which he did by accident, at least the right one. So now Missy was stuck in the car, her boyfriend was stuck about a foot away from the car, and the two giant forest monsters were rolling directly toward them. Missy yelled for her young man to get back inside. He said he couldn't. He'd have to jump out of his boots. She told him to look to his right. He did. He saw the monsters about to slam into all of them. Well, he jumped out of his boots and was back in the Model A just in time for the creatures to slam into their front fender, loosening them from the mud and sending them sliding back down the hill they had just come up. The collision also turned off the engine, frantically turning this lever this way and that dial that. The young man furiously attempted to restart the vehicle before they slid backward into anything. He must have turned a dial 3/5 instead of 3/4 or something, because the magic formula did not work, and they continued to slide backward. Missy screamed for him to steer them away from the tree they were heading toward, and soon he entirely gave up trying to start the engine in favor of trying to keep them from slamming backward into something that would be just as deadly as the monsters they had just escaped. He worked on applying the emergency brake. And then Ahead, they saw that they actually hadn't escaped the monsters at all, or at least not both of them. Maybe the Rougarou beat the Boogity Man, or maybe the Boogity Man grabbed his prize and escaped. But in either case, the Dogman was done with that Sasquatch. Now, Missy and her man could see that the Rougarou was chasing them down the hill. The young man ceased trying to operate any brake at all, as he hoped to somehow elude the monster that was getting closer with each step. I'm not clear if the Rougarou was pursuing them on all fours as a dog, or on his hind legs like a werewolf or a man. I just know that according to the story, he followed them down this muddy, steep embankment, and then he himself slipped in the mud and began sliding and tumbling toward the Model A. The Dogman had completely lost control, and the boyfriend only barely had his vehicle under some degree of control. It was looking like they were heading for a huge smash-up into whatever was going to end up being at the bottom of the hill. So it turned out the bottom of the hill was a little settlement, and they smashed directly into a private home. Both Missy and her guy were knocked unconscious by the crash, and they woke up parked inside this couple's living room. They didn't see the Rougarou anywhere, and nobody outside of our family even believed their story. Grandma Lou's brothers had to rebuild the family's home for them, and Missy moved west to get away from people calling her a liar, and also to get away from the Rougarou and the Boogity Man. And that's kind of how I feel about it too. I love that area, but I'd rather stay in New Orleans or in one of the larger cities. I'd rather leave the swamps and the bayous to the monsters that call it their home, and probably have since before time began. This would be a good point for me to explain my situation and my family, and then I'll get back to telling you more Dogman and Bigfoot stories. I hail from Georgia, but my family history stretches back down through the Louisiana swamps and bayous. I was raised being told stories of the Rougarou and the Boogity Man. Most of these stories go back to my Grandma Lou, my mother's mother who I never met. Actually, there is a photo of me as a baby being held in her arms shortly before her passing, but I have no memory of her myself. To give you a sense of the time these stories took place in, I am now 60, and I first heard them around 50 years ago. My mother heard them 2 decades earlier than that when she was a kid, and they were old then. Some were passed down to Grandma Lou by her parents, so some of these are very old stories. The reason I'm passing them on to you, though, and the reason I'm compiling and remembering them now, is because of something that happened to me just about 6 or 8 months ago. My mom had passed on after a long illness. The family was exhausted both emotionally and financially, and we all gathered together to clean out her old house, the house I had grown up in, so that we could sell it and all get back on our feet. It was time to start looking toward the future again, or so I thought. One night, I was at the house later than everyone else, going through some of my old stuff in the attic. I was finding it hard to think of throwing these things out, even though I thought my mother had thrown them out years earlier. I came across some drawings I had done as a kid of monsters. Most of them were monsters I saw on the TV. Godzilla, Gamera, Gappa, lots of monsters with names that started with a G. And then, I came across a green ape, and all at once, the stories of the Boogity Man came rushing back. I also found a drawing of the Rougarou, which I had done. These were stories and characters I hadn't thought about in so long the nostalgia was thick in the air. When I finally realized how late it had become, I grabbed a few things I wanted to keep and headed down out of the house to my car. As I left the house, the block was dark, and I could hear crickets, really loud crickets everywhere. I live in the suburbs these days, but my mom lived in the sticks, and out there you get more stars in the sky and more crickets everywhere. But even that carried a nostalgic feeling for me, and I stood there, appreciating it for a moment before heading to my car and home. As I listened, I thought I was going deaf as the sound of the crickets got quieter and sort of faded into nothing. I swallowed hard and messed with my ears. It felt like I was going up in a fast elevator, like the pressure of the air was changing. And that's when I heard something I hadn't expected to hear. It sounded like a branch snapping, but not a small branch. It sounded like something had bent a large tree branch right off a tree. I looked toward where I heard the sound, and I saw the silhouette of what appeared to be, well, a ridiculously tall version of Batman. It had tall ears on top of its head, and it looked incredibly strong. I ran to my car and I flew into it, locking the door behind me and looking back at the spot I'd seen the shadow, while nervously inserting the key everywhere but into the ignition. Before I could get the engine to start, I found the spot with my eyes. It still looked like the shadow of a cartoonishly large man. Was it pareidolia? Or was it something else combining to produce the illusion of a nightmare creature standing next to my mother's house? Was the intense memory of my childhood manifesting as a hallucination to my tired mind? Then, the shadow took a half step forward. Just enough of it came into the light that I could see that this was a three-dimensional creature, or a three-dimensional illusion at the very least. It was not a moving shadow. It was something solid that cast a shadow. It was the Rougarou, the werewolf, the wolfman, the dogman. This was the modern incarnation of Anubis. This was the creature that my mom had told me about through my childhood. I got out of there without looking back, and I've never gone back there again after dark. The thing about this encounter with an apparent werewolf-like entity was that my mother never told us that these creatures lived in Georgia when we were kids. She always told us that if we were bad, she was going to take us down to Louisiana and leave us in the swamp for the Rougarou and the Boogity man to get. She never said the Rougarou lived in our neighborhood. Yet that was who, or what, I think I saw. So I hope you can understand why I feel a bit obsessed with remembering and writing down every one of the stories I heard as a child. It's possible there's some truth behind this folklore, and even if not, it deserves to be preserved just as a series of fascinating stories. In my personal opinion, some of these sound like they might have been real witness encounters, while some of the others sound like they might have started with a kernel of truth and then became legends, with a lot of fiction placed on top as a whipped cream dressing. And then some of them feel to me like cautionary tales, just created to scare kids into behaving and listening to their parents. But who is to say some of those stories aren't also based on truth? Nevertheless, I'm presenting them here as a chronicle of stories, not as a news report. I don't really know if these stories are true. I did believe them when I was a kid. I hadn't believed them for my entire adult life, but the huge thing I saw by my mother's house that night has moved me from either of those two first places into a third place, a place of wonder. I don't know for a fact if these old family stories are true, but after seeing what I saw, I do now admit that I wonder about it. Let me start with a story that Grandma Lou says happened before she was born to her parents. They had just moved to the forest down there and built their own home with their own hands. Grandma Lou's father had dug a well, and there was enough water there for them to start their own farm, cut out of the woods. When asked where this all took place, Grandma Lou apparently would always answer, nowhere. When asked to elaborate, she would insist that she grew up literally nowhere. There was no name for it, because there was no town there, no other people. Consequently, she and her family were extreme individualists. They had nobody around them to influence their behavior, so how could they end up any other way? One time, my mother told me that Grandma Lou said something about a nearby town called Mudville. I liked that because it reminded me of the poem Casey at the Bat. I always visualized Mudville as having a baseball team, maybe the actual baseball team that the poem might have been based on. I never looked it up though. In putting together these stories, I went to Google Maps and I typed in Mudville. Mudville, Louisiana. I got this tiny town so small that Google Street View has literally never visited it. Here's a clear cut off US 165 leading in the direction of Mudville, Louisiana. That's the closest I can get to showing you an actual picture of it. Now, I don't know if this is the same Mudville that Grandma Lou is supposed to have said she grew up near. I don't even know if this Mudville was in existence 120 years ago. But it does look like it's surrounded by woods and swamps that do look like they might have been the settings for these stories. Anyway, about a year before Grandma Lou was born, something got into her father's stable and bit their horse on its rear. The horse wasn't severely injured, but neither of them could figure out how something got in or what even happened. That night they took turns staying up, waiting to catch whatever had done it. They suspected it might be a big cat, and they were both on edge, nervous that the cat might get them before they could get it. Well, no cat showed up that night, I'll tell you. There was a predator that did drop by, but it was no cat. It was a dog, but the strangest looking dog you could ever hope to see. The way it was described to me always made me visualize a hyena. When it stood on all fours, its front was much higher than its rear. It had a massive head that was mainly a huge mouth. It looked like a shark, but furry and on land, like an eating machine. It had stripes on its back like a tiger, but the head of the largest mouthed dog on the planet. In different versions of the story, either Grandma Lou's mother or father stands up and aims at the monster dog, shouting at it to go away or get blasted. They didn't actually shoot because the thing was so large, they weren't really sure how many shots it would take to fell it. If they could scare it off, that might be a better arrangement for everyone involved. The thing ignored Grandma Lou's parents and kept marching toward the horse stable. Her parents fired a shot over the creature's head, and the loud retort from the blast got its full attention. It stopped walking, stared at the two humans there, and then it stood up on its hind legs, and it screamed at them. It didn't sound like a dog. Supposedly it sounded like a woman in pain or something. They said it was the most terrifying sound they had ever heard. They couldn't afford to go back, though. They needed to protect their horse. So they fired toward the screaming upright walking dog giant. And according to Grandma Lou, the giant upright canine just disappeared. There was no flash of light or sound or anything. The creature was there, and then the creature was not. If that happened to me, I don't know what I would do. I think I'd feel like I was going out of my mind. And at the same time, I'd wonder if the invisible dogman was somewhere around, maybe running right at me. I'd want to get out of there as quickly as I could. This was how my family ancestors got religion. Convinced they had been visited by some emissary of the devil, they found a church in the area and became regular churchgoers. They would have the preacher come out and pray over their land. They had asked him to bless the land and give them holy water, but he was a Protestant, not a Catholic. They built crosses around the property to try to ward off the Rougarou, and soon Grandma Lou was born. She was their first of 7 children. They would all grow up seeing monsters in the swamps, but the monsters never again entered onto their property, nor did any of them ever attack their livestock again. The Dogman, the Boogity Man, and the Traveler. One night when she was young, a traveler knocked on Grandma Lou's family's door late one night. They had all been asleep, and were more than a little frightened that someone would be knocking on their door this late. Still, they were in the middle of nowhere as I previously established, so it was sort of their duty to answer any knocks any time of day. If someone was lost out there, they weren't going to find anyone else to help them for a number of miles. So Grandma Lou's father got his weapon and went to the door to see who it was. As expected, it was a lost traveler, but the story he told and the panicked expression in his eye caused my great-great-grandfather to pull the man into the house and lock the door behind him. You see, the man claimed he had been chased there through the woods. Chased by the Boogity Man. He didn't use that term, of course. That was my family's personal name for him. But he described what chased him, and it sounds an awful lot like a Bigfoot. This guy saw him up close, and this guy got a good whiff of the Boogity Man as well. Let me start the story at the beginning. So, This fella said he was walking out west camping along the way. Was that a thing back then? I guess before Greyhound you walked places? Anyway, this guy was just walking, and he said suddenly it started smelling really bad, like something nearby had died and was rotting. He looked up, and the path in front of him was blocked by the biggest, hairiest thing he had ever seen. He turned around to run, and as he did, he saw a second creature, just as big as the first, step out onto the road behind him. Now he had one on either side, and nowhere to go, except the woods. So he ran between the trees in the night, not having any idea where he was heading or how he might escape this giant tribe of hairy primitive humans. Through the trees he raced, scratching himself up all over. He kept finding them in front of him, and he kept changing his course. It didn't take long before he was completely unaware of which way was north, east, west, or safety. He says the creatures toyed with him, and he could hear them making this sound, which he interpreted as laughter. That was when he found this house in the woods, and my kind ancestors took pity on him. As he finished his tale, the sound of something hitting the roof echoed through the house. Then it sounded like something hit one of the walls. Then the wall on the other side of the house was hit. They were surrounded, and the primitive men were throwing stones or sticks at their house. "They want me to come out," said the traveler. "If I stay in here, I'll just endanger all of you." He got up and prepared to sacrifice himself to the monsters, but Grandma Lou's parents refused to let him leave. Instead, they all got on their knees and started praying. They prayed for guidance, and they prayed for protection. They prayed for the protection of this traveler. As they prayed, the sounds of the stones hitting the house grew fewer and fewer, and eventually stopped altogether. Everyone caught a few hours of sleep, and then the sun was up, and the traveler was invited to stay for breakfast before moving on. Over breakfast, he told them the story of his own encounter with the Rougarou, or the Dogman, who he said was a shapeshifter. He even named the man he claimed turned into the Rougarou. He was a banker in a town south of there who got caught cheating in a card game by a wizard and turned into a werewolf or Rougarou. Grandma Lou's parents told him they thought the Rougarou was a natural animal of the area, but that man insisted that it was in fact supernatural, and from then on, they always wondered if that might be true. There were different stories about how a person could become a Rougarou, or a Dogman, or a werewolf. It was kind of like catching a disease. If there was contact between bodily fluids, you might become a werewolf. That one sort of made the most sense to me personally when I was told these stories as a kid. There were other ways you could become a Rougarou that involved not following Catholic tradition. Grandma Lou's parents had become Protestant, so they didn't put too much stock in those theories. They were frightened by the implication that the Rougarou could choose who to pass his curse on to, and they raised Grandma Lou to be careful who she made enemies with. Don't make an enemy of the Rougarou. If you're lucky, he'll kill you. If you're unlucky, he'll make you like he is. Grandma Lou always made friends with everybody. That was her reputation. My mother, too, for the most part. I suppose I might have turned out nicer if I had started believing in these Rougarou stories sooner. Such as the Rougarou and the Rhubarb. Now, before I start this story, I want to say that I'm not 100% certain that rhubarb was actually the plant this story was about, but I'm pretty sure it was. Grandma Lou and her family grew some crops on their farm, but they also lived off of hunting small game and knowing where certain different kinds of edible plants lived. They also knew when things were in season, and they would go forage the woods during those seasons, picking things they could make into pies or dry out to eat over the winter. One day, Grandma Lou was sent out by herself to pick some rhubarb to make into pies. It was almost her last trip into the woods ever, because that day, she practically came face to face with Dogman. Now, I have never picked rhubarb or whatever it was she was picking, but I am led to understand that it is something that grows low to the ground, like salad. Not salad, lettuce or cabbage. So I'm imagining that Grandma Lou is down on her hands and knees collecting whatever part of the rhubarb is meant to be collected when she heard the sound of something large in the woods around her. She saw the shadow of whatever it was cast by the morning sun on some trees and bushes as it passed, and she could make out that it stood like a man, but it seemed to have a dog-shaped head. The Rougarou, the Dogman, in broad daylight. He must have traveled further than usual hunting last night and was getting back to wherever he liked to sleep. That was extra bad news, as it meant he might still be hungry. At this point, when my mother told the story, she said Grandma Lou would insist that if you find yourself in the woods and realize the Dogman or Rougarou is in the vicinity before he realizes that you are, you must be silent, and you must remain silent. Grandma learned that lesson the hard way. When she saw the shadow of the Rougarou, she let out an all too audible gasp. She could see by the shadow that the creature had turned in her direction. That old Rougarou didn't take but another second or two to burst through the bushes and look her straight in the eye. Now, in this version of the story, the Dogman is on his hind legs right from the start. He's not described as having stripes or looking like a hyena. He's described as a huge, hairy man covered in gray fur with a dog head. His fur is described as hanging unevenly and long, like Spanish moss hanging off trees. Even in the daylight, his eyes seemed lit from within, a yellowy color. He had a long snout and was dark everywhere. He was big on top and small on the bottom, like an exaggerated version of a muscle man, mixed with a large dark gray wolf. Now, my mother would stop there and tell me that Grandma Lou would always insist at this point that it's important, when facing a Rougarou directly, to never run away. There are a few ways you might possibly survive a direct encounter if you're resourceful, if you're prepared, if you're lucky, but your chances for survival drop drastically once you try to run away. This excites the animal urges which control the monster, and from then on, the creature only will see you as prey and nothing else. If you're face to face with it, you still have a chance to either intimidate it or find some other tactic to dissuade it from thinking of you as a meal. Once it's viewing you from behind running away, that's like an advertisement to chase you. That's like putting up a McDonald's sign on the freeway with directions on the bottom, or directions to your bottom. Now, of course, on that day, Grandma Lou did get up, and she did run away. But according to my mother, she would always say it was just dumb luck that let her get away, and that's something you cannot count on. Grandma Lou said she ran, and she could hear the creature pursue her. She ran into a small cave she knew about. She called it Echo Cave because she could throw her voice from in there to make it sound like someone was outside. She pulled some scrub brush over the entrance to the cave. Since it was light out, she could see out of the cave, but she hoped the Dogman wouldn't be able to see in. That old Rougarou didn't take long catching up to her and sniffed around the entrance. Then he started howling and Grandma Lou got terrified. Was he calling others? The sound reverberated in the cave and soon she heard other wolves howling in the distance. Or was that the echo from the first wolf bouncing off the insides of Echo Cave? Grandma Lou's heart was beating fast and she wasn't sure what to do when she could hear the Rougarou. He was speaking to her, or to somebody. It wasn't in English, though. It was in French. "Où es-tu?" asked a deep growling voice. "Où es-tu?" Grandma Lou found this upsetting on more levels than I understood as a kid. I didn't know French, first of all. It translates to the wolf asking, "Where are you?" But he's asking it in the personal way, as though he were friends or family with Grandma Lou. Second of all, my mother could forgive an animal if it killed and ate her, because that was just the way of nature. But if the Rougarou had the intelligence of a man, that meant he was choosing to behave in a savage manner and chase her. That was something that Grandma Lou felt that only the Lord could forgive, as this was a crime against humanity itself, perpetrated by a most unnatural creature. Still terrified but now thoroughly insulted and indignant, Grandma Lou set about coming up with a plan to get out of there. If the wolf understood French, maybe she could use that to her advantage. So Grandma Lou did her echo cave trick, throwing her voice to sound as though she were out in the swamp beyond the cave, behind the monster. "Je suis là," shouted Grandma Lou. "I am here." She watched through the dry brush as the Rougarou looked exactly where she wanted him to look. "Je ne te vois pas," he growled. "I don't see you." "Rapprochez-vous," Grandma Lou echoed out into the swamp. "You must get closer." So the Rougarou, he walked over toward the swamp, and he leaned over, but he still didn't see her. He turned around to say something, but Grandma Lou was already out of the cave with a big old rock in her hand, and before that old dogman could do anything, she had tossed it hard right at his noggin. Now there was no rock a little girl could throw that was ever going to hurt a Rougarou, but Grandma Lou had caught that old dogman by surprise, and the rock hitting him unexpectedly on top of everything was enough to send him off balance in the slippery mud, falling headlong and sideways right into a really muddy, wet pit. It was almost like what you would call quicksand, only it was mud. If it were a little less dirty, it would have been a deep pond. If it were a little drier, it might have been a sand pit. But as it was at that particular point in history, that Rougarou fell into a very liquid mud pit. It made him slippery all over and gave him nothing to grab onto or use to get out of his situation. He wasn't sinking, but he wasn't getting any closer to the side of the hole either, and the more he flailed about, the more covered in mud and enraged he became. That's when Grandma Lou bid her fond adieu to the Rougarou and raced back to her house with her prized rhubarb intact. She went home and told her family what happened, and they all had a good long laugh at the Rougarou's expense. But that was the last time anyone from the family was allowed to forage or hunt alone, and especially unarmed. They had always assumed that the Rougarou was nocturnal. As long as they respected his turf in the dark, they assumed he respected theirs during the day. Now that they knew that the forests were patrolled by savage yet intelligent Rougarou, even during the daylight hours, it changed their perspective toward and relationship with the forest that surrounded them. But there were other stories of the Dogman at night, such as this one called Rougarou the Night Owl. This was a story for young adults about staying out too late or breaking curfew. According to this one, the Rougarou is once again a full-time animal who lives in the forests and swamps. Although he is in most ways a natural being, he does possess some supernatural powers. For instance, if you disobeyed your parents, the Rougarou has the ability to cause you to get confused on your way home. Instead of walking toward safety, you begin unconsciously making opposite turns. In one version of the story, the Rougarou makes the victim walk into a bad neighborhood where he is robbed. But in this version, which is alleged to have happened to a younger brother of Grandma Lou, the Rougarou hypnotized the brother to walk directly into the forest near the cave in which the Rougarou most liked to dine. The brother is supposed to have described the experience as not feeling as though he were under any control at all. He just felt like he was continuing to walk home, and he felt as though every turn and move he made was the logical one to get him closer to his family. Even after he was in the forest at night, climbing over roots and under branches, he never thought that strange. He kept visualizing home on the other side of this next patch of woods, and he was in a good spirit and feeling chipper and alert throughout. He said that when he came into the clearing and saw the big dog across the field, even that did not wake him from his reverie. When he saw the dog stand up, revealing itself to be not actually a dog at all, but a strange hairy humanoid with a dog head, he said he grew very confused. A voice in his head told him, "This is normal. This happens to you every day." He wondered, does this really happen to me every day? Then he heard that voice say yes, but he felt his inner self say no. Suddenly it was like he was back in control, and he was looking at this giant man dog that was walking swiftly toward him. He began shouting the Lord's Prayer and running home. He had not been particularly religious prior to that, so the Lord's Prayer was the only one he could remember. This incident scared him so much, though, that after that he memorized a prayer a day, just in case he once again ran into the Rougarou. One of Grandma Lou's younger sisters was a sleepwalker, and she wandered out of the house one night and straight into the woods. Grandma Lou realized during a trip to the outhouse in the middle of the night that her sister was gone. She alerted their dad, and the two of them went off into the forest with a lantern, shouting for the girl to wake up and to come home. They wandered deep into the woods, and the muddy trail left a pretty clear impression of where she had gone. They could see her tracks, but even though they hurried along after her, they never saw her off in the distance, and it never seemed as though they were getting any closer. The tracks she left were not those of someone running. They were of someone strolling, so the two of them should have been able to catch up to her. This was beginning to make them panic, and Grandma Lou said her father told her to go home. He sensed some kind of magic or badness was at play, and he wanted Grandma Lou to be safe. While they were arguing about this, around these trees to their right, out walked Grandma Lou's sister, along with the Rougarou. They were both just walking next to each other like they were buds or something. The girl looked in a daze, and the dogman kinda did also. Neither of them acknowledged Grandma Lou or her dad. They just acted like they were going to walk on past them, like they were commuters, still not really awake from the weekend, heading to work, but not really wanting to go. Grandma Lou says her father just picked up her sister like she was a rug, flung her over his shoulders, then started walking for home. Grandma Lou ran after, watching the old Rougarou, who just kept walking in the direction he was going to walk in anyway. Mom said that was the only time Grandma Lou saw the dogman act like that. She had a kind of a crazy theory to explain it. What if the dogman, what if he was sleepwalking too? That sister kept sleepwalking for the rest of her life. First, the family put a latch on the door to keep her from sleepwalking outside, but when she grew tall enough, she just learned how to unlatch it in her sleep. That time, she was eventually found asleep on a flat rock in the woods as though she were in bed. Grandma Lou's father figured out a way to add a key lock on the inside of the house's two doors, then to keep the key away from the sister. So she climbed out one of the windows and walked into the forest anyway. That time, she was found walking back and forth between two trees. When they caught up to her, she said she was ball girl at a tennis match and she couldn't leave. She was tiring out the entire family, but she would never have any memory of it herself the next day. By the time she was marrying age, Grandma Lou's mother had matched the sister up with the son of a lady from church that she got along with. At first, the two young people got along fine as well, but a week before they were to get married, the sister went sleepwalking again. This time, Grandma Lou's dad had taken to locking all the windows shut from the outside before bedtime to keep her inside for the night. The next morning, the sister woke up in a tree almost 2 miles from the family farm. That event caused her suitor to lose interest. He said that a wife who won't stay in her husband's bedroom all night wouldn't make much of a wife at all. From then on, that sister grew old and never tried to marry again. The family even called her the bride of the Rougarou behind her back. She grew ever more distant, and her sleepwalking progressed to the point where she had to be locked in her own special padded room each night to sleep in. Even though the Rougarou itself only appeared in the first of these sleepwalking stories, somehow he was blamed, or at least associated with her malady. Perhaps that was superstition, or perhaps they had an understanding of the Rougarou that modern city folk like me just don't possess. The Dogman Under the Bed. Grandma Lou had a nephew, Roger, who I actually got to meet once. I don't remember who he was the son of, but he was her nephew, Roger, and I called him Uncle. He told me a story about staying at the house to work on the farm and how he would see the Dogman every night in his bedroom. The story was that Roger would see the Dogman emerge either from under his bed or from the closet of the bedroom he shared with two of the other boys. It would emerge as a flat shadow being, or a living shadow that moved along the wall or floor. It would go to the window, and where the shadow was flat on the wall, it appeared as a three-dimensional werewolf-like creature when it was outside the window. He claimed he would try to wake the other boys, but they would never wake up. One time, he said the Dogman even leaned in the window looking at him and put a Dogman finger across his Dogman lips, as if to say, "Shh." He began to sort of almost get used to it. After all, what did it matter if someone else used the underside of his bed during the day, and he used the top side of it at night? Sure, it wasn't human, but other things have a right to live too. If it wasn't meant to be here, then God wouldn't have put it there, that's what he felt. He came up with all sorts of arguments to convince himself that it wasn't really a problem having a dog-headed shadow being in his room that would manifest at night. One morning he woke up and found chicken feathers all over the floor of his room. There were members of the family screaming outside. He ran out there and learned that the chicken coop had been raided and all the birds were gone. He remembered the feathers in his room. The Dogman. The Rougarou. It had to be the thing under his bed. He told the family loudly that he had something important to show all of them. He led them up to his bedroom and showed them the chicken feathers all over the floor. He explained that the Dogman was living under his bed and it came out at night and became three-dimensional, and that's who stole the chickens. Well, he got punished, the worst punishment of his young life, for doing what they thought he did to the chickens, and then for lying about it. He got sent home to his parents, and he wasn't allowed to work on the farm any longer. He was not believed when he said he didn't know where the chickens went to, but I think we can all be certain that he had no idea at all. The Dogman, by the berry bush. There were a number of stories about the Dogman getting you or kidnapping you. This one was supposed to have happened when Grandma Lou was first married herself, still living out of the family farm in the woods. They just built a bedroom onto the side of the house and moved forward. So, Grandma Lou and her new husband were out picking berries, and this was the day when they learned two important things. 1. You must, when picking berries, always keep your berry-picking partner in your line of vision because 2. The Rougarou uses the berry patch as a hunting ground. On this day, the two newlyweds were in a good mood and behaving playfully. They chased each other around in the forest, which made them hungry. When they found the berry bushes, they ate their fill instead of collecting them in the baskets they had brought. After playing and goofing off much of the day, they realized they'd need to be heading back soon. They set about doing their task, which they could have done hours earlier if they hadn't been lost in young love instead. Now, finding good berries at this point was a lot harder, as they had eaten most of the best and ripest ones earlier. They both separated and got lost in concentrating on their work before it got dark. It was still a little while till sundown, but it gets darker under the canopy of trees faster than it does outside. Soon, the two were so carried away in getting their jobs done that they entirely lost awareness of each other. That's the time when the Dogman is going to come get you, the second you get lost in your own little world. He's willing to sit or stand around for hours, just watching you, studying you, listening to what you're thinking, and waiting until he can see with his eyes and hear with his mind that you aren't paying attention any longer. And that's when the Rougarou comes, and he takes you. Where he takes you, nobody knows because nobody's ever come back to tell. So on that day, lost in her own world, Grandma Lou says it started to smell really bad, and she started giggling to herself, thinking that the berries must have given her husband the gas. In the next instant, she heard the family shotgun go off, and she knew instantly that her husband was in a lot more trouble than she thought. She came around the tree running toward his side of the berry bushes, and she almost ran smack into the Rougarou herself, with her husband slung over his giant shoulder, like he had a kitten up there or something. Grandma Lou said she never saw anything as large as this Rougarou. He must have been the granddaddy of them all. Even though she saw her own husband over this monster's shoulders, she knew she better respect him, and so she addressed him as Granddaddy Rougarou, and he stopped to watch her curiously. Grandma Lou explained that he had her man over his shoulder, and that she loved that man. She was carrying that man's seed, and without him, she and her baby both might not be able to survive. She begged that giant man that if he needed food, she could trade him food for her husband's life. If he needed something else, she would get it for him, no matter what it took. That was how much she loved her husband. Grandma Lou says the Rougarou stood there, staring into her eyes for the longest time. She couldn't read its expression, as all she could see was the glow of its eyes and its dog-shaped head. It felt like the moment would never end, but she had said her piece and would need to wait to find out what the giant dogman would do. At great length, with extreme slowness, the creature gently and delicately laid her husband down at her feet. He wasn't moving, and Grandma Lou didn't know if he was alive or not, but she knew she would have to wait to check on that, as she was afraid to break eye contact with the immense beast in front of her. As slowly as the dogman had laid the man down, that's how fast he snatched up both baskets and sped off into the forest, disappearing from sight almost like magic. I don't mean he disappeared as the other Rougarou was said to have done in that earlier story. I mean that he left the scene so quickly, it was almost as though he had disappeared. Grandma Lou stayed with her husband until he woke up. He probably had a concussion or something, as they say he was never quite the same after that. Of course, he never saw a doctor about it, and nobody knows if it played into his early death, which happened before he was 30. But the one thing we do know is that from then on, the family would never allow each other out of each other's vision when going berry picking. I also remember another story about a kid getting into trouble because of a cryptid. My mom used to call that one the Boogity Baby Water Well. One day, my Grandma Lou's youngest brother Caleb was sent out to fetch water from the well. As he approached the well, though, he could smell something really awful. He looked down, and in there was a dark, strange animal at the bottom, floating in the water. At first he thought it had passed on already, and so hence the smell, but he saw it move, and he called down to it. The animal looked up immediately, and he could see it was a kind of a caveman child, or a humanoid covered in thick, dark fur from head to toe. He had never seen an ape or a monkey, so he had nothing to compare it to. Thinking it might be a human, he tried talking to it. The creature seemed to respond in the positive, being interested in what he was saying, but it never attempted to respond, and he couldn't be sure it was understanding a single word. He thought about climbing down there, but if the boy turned out to be savage, he could get hurt or killed. Finally, he resolved to untie his rope from his bucket, tie it to a sturdy tree, then drop it down the hole and let the creature climb out on its own. If it were injured, then he would find out that way and come up with a better plan. But if it could climb out on its own, then he could watch the whole thing from a safe distance, make certain not to get himself hurt, and to get the water he was sent to fetch in the first place. So he followed through with his plan and dropped the rope into the hole. The creature looked at the twine curiously, not sure what to do with it. Caleb made a hand-over-hand motion, trying to signal to the hairy young man that he could climb out of the hole get out of the water and get free. When he saw the hairy boy's eyes light up and watched him beginning to ascend, he could see that he was uninjured from his fall and would soon be out of his predicament. Caleb took cover behind the boulders some distance from the well, but he could monitor the situation from where he was. The creature came out of the hole and began jumping up and down, making a terrible racket. Something happened that Caleb hadn't even considered before. The mother of the creature crashed out of the swamp and began screaming at what was obviously her offspring. It sounded almost as though she were speaking a language and bawling him out for getting lost and making her frightened. Enraged, she grabbed Caleb's water rope and tugged on it, tearing the tree he had tied it to straight up out of the ground. The mother then screamed. The younger one jumped on the larger one's back, and in a second, both were gone from the woods. It took some lifting to get the tree off of the well, but eventually Caleb succeeded in doing this. He reattached the rope to the bucket and lowered it into the water to finally do the chore he had originally been assigned to do. But when Caleb pulled up the water, he found it smelled just like that baby Boogity man had. It wasn't sweet to the taste anymore either. He brought it back to the house, but his parents proceeded to punish him for fouling up their drinking water. They made him march a quarter-mile to the nearest stream to get water for the next 2 months until the well cleared up again. I never understood why poor Caleb got punished if everyone in the family believed in the Boogity Man. I mean, how else could the water have gotten that fouled up? And how could a boy have done that on his own? Maybe there's some part of that story which has been lost to history. Speaking of lost to history, thank you for helping to preserve my family's heritage. Maybe people will listen to these stories and remember my grandma Lou. And that way, she might live on, at least for a while longer. And with her spirit, also survives the last great free sentient creatures in the USA. The Bigfoot and the Dogman. Wow, thank you if you made it all the way through that show. We really appreciate you watching. And we also appreciate today's executive producer, who is Monica Gibson. Monica Gibson, she's a real pip, son. Monica is our newest channel member, which means she gets to see our secret Sunday uncensored stories. Here's Henry Lee Dogman to explain further. Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it with your friends and family that you think might also be interested. If you would like to see more of our work, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon next to the subscribe button so that YouTube will alert you when we put out a new video. To become a channel member and gain access to our special perks, you can click that join link under each of our videos. Another option is to join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. You can join for as little as 99 cents on YouTube or $1.50 at peterbernard.com, and that gains you access to our weekly secret uncensored episodes. If you'd like to see our 21 hours of archives of uncensored Dogman stories, then please join at the $3 level or above. To get to watch our shows in advance of the public, please join at our $10 level. That gets you all the perks. If you join our channel memberships, you need to check our community page here on YouTube in order to get the links to the secret videos and other perks. If you're in the PayPal subscribers club, Peter will email you all the news and links himself. Once joining the PayPal club, which is Peter's homemade club, please give him a chance to see that you've joined and to compose you a personal welcome email, as none of that is automated. But whichever you join, we'll name you an executive producer for the next available episode. Do you have a scary experience that you'd like to share with us? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LA-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. It's a Google voicemail box, so that means it keeps cutting off after every 3 minutes. If your story is longer than that, please keep calling back and we can piece it together on our end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.